Well, thank you all for having me, and I thought that since we're here kind of promoting the book a little bit, it's actually not super new. It's been out like over a year now, Non-Duality Press. And I wrote that book when I was still in the monastery, so I thought I'd just share a little bit about how the book was written, and how it came to be, and you know, that's also something that I could do pretty briefly, so I don't have a lot of time. But yeah, I was a Christian monk in the Trappist order part of the time. I entered the monastic life in 1981 at the age of 22, and I just felt very drawn to it. I felt called to it. Very kind of early in life, I felt a sense that the only kind of life that really made sense to me was to give my whole life to God in some way. I was from obviously a Roman Catholic background, and the biggest model that I had in terms of people coming to a sense of union with God was through the Christian mystics. And I especially love St. Francis. That's how I got the name Francis. And we take names in the monastery. My birth name was Dale, actually. So my religious name was Francis, and I still use that. So I entered the monastery, and right away I entered the monastery of Thomas Merton, who's a very famous spiritual writer who died in 1968 at that same monastery when I was just a kid. But I was very influenced by him in high school. A high school teacher let me know about Merton, and I started reading some of his books, and by the time I got to the end of high school, I'd literally read every book he published, so he was kind of a hero for me. And one of the things that he did was he very much explored the Eastern traditions and sort of saw the parallels between the deep Christian mystical path and some of the deep mystical paths of Buddhism, of Zen, Tibetan Buddhism, Advaita Vedanta, really all the major traditions, Sufism, Kabir, Rumi, these types of mystics. And so, and he wrote a book, one of his books is called Mystics and Zen Masters, which was a very good book about that genre of the Eastern mysticism and how there's parallels with Christian mysticism. So early on in my monastic life, I started studying Zen with some Zen masters, and I ended up studying Zen with 2 teachers, going to Zen retreats and doing that. And then soon after that, I discovered Vipassana meditation, which is a type of Buddhist meditation that comes from the Southeast Asian Theravadan strand of Buddhism. And it's often called insight meditation. You have places right here in England, Gaia House is one, very well known, and you have Amaravati Monastery in Chithurst that were headed up for many years by Ajahn Sumedho, who some of you, I'm sure at least one of you has heard of because you mentioned them to me. And I was kind of very interested in that tradition. So some people were a little shocked, but even though I was a Christian monk, we had the leeway and we had encouragement to explore other spiritual paths if we found that helpful for our spiritual growth. So I did that, and for many, many years I had kind of little openings into reality, you could say, into the reality of what I would call God or presence. You can call it what you like or call it nothing at all, but that's what I called it at the time. So I started out in Zen, finding some answers, and obviously in the Christian mystical tradition. I was involved in deep contemplative prayer, you know, as a monk, and meditative, and so I was involved in that. And then gradually with this Vipassana practice, it all kind of melded together, and I began seeing a little bit more clearly the nature of reality, kind of what it was essentially, who I was essentially. I'd have little glimpses. So for many years there were many glimpses and many kind of clarities that would come. They would come and go. You know, it was kind of that found it, lost it sort of experience that happens on the spiritual journey. And then in 2010, in the middle of Mass, I suddenly had a very deep sense of the presence of God in the room and kind of everywhere permeating. And I'd had that experience many times before, but somehow this time there seemed to be some difference in tone. It seemed particularly deep and profound. And as I looked down at the host, we in the Catholic tradition, of course, we receive communion of the Eucharist. It's made up of a host and wine in commemoration of the death and burial and resurrection of Christ in the Christian kind of belief. I looked down at that host, and in the Catholic theology, the host, the Eucharistic bread, is seen to contain the real presence, what they talk about as the real presence of Christ. So my sense, for many, many years since a child, was that the real presence of Christ somehow was contained in that Eucharistic bread. But in this experience, I wouldn't even call it an experience exactly, but in this kind of discovery, I looked down at the host, and the phenomenal sort of reality of what I was seeing was that it was sort of suffused with this light, this soft light, and it seemed to expand, 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 and I realized that it was really filling the whole room, filling everyone in the room, everything in the room. And my sense was that all along I had sort of had this idea that the true presence of Christ was somehow exclusively in this Eucharistic bread. I realized, oh, the real presence, what we used to call the real presence in Catholic theology, the real presence of Christ, you could say, as a kind of pointer to the nature of this kind of consciousness, really is everywhere. That God is in everything, everything is in God. That the presence of God is actually who I am on the deepest level, and who you are. And that's what came to me that day at Mass, and that's never really left since. And that's really what that book is about. My spiritual director asked me after that to write a book to try to kind of articulate this insight that had come to me, because at first I couldn't really speak about it. I went for a good 7, 8 months not really talking a lot at all, especially not talking much about that. And he thought it would be a good idea, because I'd done a lot of journaling, if I wrote about the experience and tried to sort of articulate it, put it into words as best I could. The words don't contain it, can't possibly contain it, but it was a way of me maybe getting more in touch with what had happened and coming to some understanding myself. So I did that and gave him the copies of what I wrote in notebooks. And in the course of a year, he got quite a bit of that, and he thought also that it would maybe make a book. So then I started kind of shifting and organizing it into a book, and I Am That I Am kind of came out of that. And then I eventually, I met a teacher who at the time was doing a lot of teaching, and still is, and has started a recovery addiction center based on non-dual spiritual principles in California. His name is Scott Kilby. And I got to know Scott a little bit, and he told me about Non-Duality Press and thought they'd be interested in the book. So I sent the manuscript that I had to them, and after some very heavy and expert editing by Catherine Noyes, which I can assure you it needed, we published the book. It's been a couple years now, I think, over a year. So it's not really exactly a new book, but it's been out at least a year, a little bit over a year. And it was written, like, as I say, when I was still in monastic life, which I left in 2012. So that's sort of the story of the book, and I guess we don't have Skadza time, so I will open it for any kind of questions or comments or anything that you might be interested in asking. Yes?
You mentioned Sufi. Faith, so that's Arabian, so doesn't that clash with your Christian?
I didn't go deeply into the Sufi path. Thomas Merton had some interest in it, and yeah, but that brings up an interesting point and a good question, is that in Trappist monastic life, I don't think there's much concern over people going into other traditions if they find them helpful. They want you to be pretty grounded in your own Christian faith and have a sense of that path pretty well. But Merton was a trailblazer in that sense. He was in the monastery and actually explored deeply the Zen tradition, the Tibetan tradition. He had met Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche at some point, and met D.T. Suzuki and several people from different traditions.
These are Zen masters, yeah?
Well, Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche was a Tibetan master. D.T. Suzuki was actually a Zen person who had apparently come to a pretty deep level of awakening, but was not a Zen master, but was a kind of academic that wrote a lot about Zen in the, I would say, 50s and 60s. And Merton was in correspondence with him, lots of people from different traditions. So I think that in monastic life, the monk or the nun enters the monastic life in order to find God, in order to really realize what they're looking for in terms of the absolute. And many contemporary monks and nuns have gone into different traditions and explored practices from them and tried to incorporate that into their own spiritual path. So it's not really seen for the most part as contradictory.
What practices would you suggest that we do to develop something more along the lines of what you have now?
Well, I do work with people individually, and I go around and give retreats and talks and things. And my basic approach that I really am drawing from my own experience, and what I teach when I work with people individually, is a 3-practice approach to a path. You might hear a lot of people these days say, well, there's nothing you can do and there's no one to do it, and you just sit back and enlightenment will just hit you on the head one day like a brick kind of falling from heaven. And my sense is that, yeah, okay, maybe not. I think that from my own experience, though, and based on my working with people over a fairly long period of time, both in the monastery and out of the monastery as a kind of spiritual director, is that the vast majority of people don't get to that way. It's kind of like, I often use the analogy of winning the lottery. You know, there's many millionaires in the world, or billionaires or whatever, but most of them didn't get there by buying a ticket and winning the lottery. You know, it's not the norm. You know, it might be possible. I would never say it's not possible, but I would say it's relatively rare. And I think it's the same with awakening. I think there is a path that leads to the realization of reality just as it is. And the Buddha talked about that you know, there's suffering, there's a cause of suffering, there's a way out of suffering, and there's a path that leads to the way out of suffering. And I think all the great saints and sages of all the traditions would probably say the same thing, at least the classical ones. But in the West, the spin that's happened with Advaita, Vedanta, and that kind of path seems to emphasize that there's no doer, there's no one to do it, and there's nothing to do, and you're already awakened. And the sort of problem with that is that there's a truth there. There is a truth that you already are pure consciousness at the essence, the core of your being. But the truth is, you're probably, like most people, many people, are not awake to that. They're not consciously aware of that. So I think there are paths that lead to that awareness. And the path that I teach is made up of 3 basic practices, which is a meditative practice or a contemplative practice, the practice of surrender, and the practice of compassionate service in the world. And my sense is that those 3 practices each develop different facets of awakened consciousness. They don't develop it really, but they uncover it. They help us realize that this awakened consciousness we seek is already at the very core of our being. So I think that those do help. They assist you. You know, my friend Rick Archer, who does this interview show, you may have heard of Buddha at the Gas Pump, he talks about, you know, what is the quote? It's something like, enlightenment is an accident, but spiritual practice makes us accident prone. So what he's saying is that, yeah, enlightenment happens in its own time, but there are certain things we can do to maybe facilitate that or encourage that. It's a lot like a garden. If you grow a garden, who makes the garden grow? I mean, God, right? We don't really make the garden grow, but there's ways that we can facilitate the growth of a garden, which is a natural act kind of God. But we can water the garden, we can make sure that the plants get plenty of sunlight, we can fertilize it, there's a lot that we can do. And then the garden grows by the grace of God, you could say. And it's the same with our personal growth in this path of awakening. So I don't know, that's a very simple answer, but that's...
Did you just expand on surrender bit? Practice for surrender?
Well, surrender, in my understanding of it, is really essentially the same as meditation. It's just the context that's different in a way. Because meditation is really touching in on the pure awareness, the consciousness that's at the very core of our being, that's prior to any kind of personal perception of reality, which we tend to judge and we think of as either pleasant or unpleasant, good or bad, I like it, I don't like it. That's kind of the personal filter that most of us view reality with most of the time. Meditation is sinking back into that awareness that's prior to that. That's just simply aware. It's just simply present to what comes. It's present to what goes. It doesn't grab on to what we like personally. It doesn't push away what we dislike personally. It's simply present to it, whatever it is. And touching in intentionally on that consciousness while sitting in a quiet room on a cushion or a chair, we call meditation. Touching in to that consciousness in the middle of a traffic jam, or while your wife or husband is screaming at you, or while your kids are yelling that they want candy before dinner, or whatever may come to you in your life. We all have these kind of familiar scenarios. Touching in on that consciousness in the midst of that, in the midst of ordinary life, I would call surrender. So I see them as really having a continuity, meditation and surrender. It's just the context. Does that make sense? Yeah. Yeah. So that's the way. A lot of people think about surrender as almost like working yourself up into some sort of sentiment of acceptance, like making yourself, that's surrender. It's like, well, I'm just going to surrender to this. I'm going to make myself accept this. But what it is, in my opinion and experience, is just finding that place deep in your heart that's already there. That's already simply present to what is, without judgment, without craving, without aversion. That's surrender. And my sense, really, talking about practice, is that surrender is the primary spiritual practice. Because our lives are primarily lived in the middle of activity, in the middle of experiences, in the middle of relating to other people, in all the ups and downs of sort of a human life. And my sense is that the primary practice has to engage that. It's fine to meditate, and I'm all for meditation and did a lot of it myself, and still sit several hours a day just in silence. I don't know if I'd call it meditation now, but it's kind of just enjoying the sense of presence, exclusively focusing on that presence, which is always present, but normally it's present with all these other things arising and ceasing within it. So in the morning I just sit quietly and enjoy that and just absorb into that. But my sense is that surrender is the same, it's just in the midst of life. So that's why I would call surrender the primary practice.
Is it the same as acceptance then, surrender?
Pardon me?
Would it be the same as acceptance?
Surrender. Acceptance is an aspect of surrender, certainly. I'd give a little teaching on surrender that I divide up into 3 levels, you could say. And the first is allowing what is. The second is embracing or accepting what is, and the third is loving what is. And the way I talk about it is it's a kind of ever deeper plunging into our hearts where that consciousness is already present. So surrender is really just uncovering what's already in our hearts, which is this presence, which is this awareness that's simply present, that's simply aware. And acceptance is a certain level of that. But the deepest level, what I have talked about as the deepest level, is what I would call loving what is. It's the name of a book, actually, by Byron Katie, that I saw you have over there, here in the bookstore. But it's just a matter of understanding and uncovering the nature of this consciousness is absolute unconditional openness. I've taken to calling it the great openness. That's the nature, that's the feel, that's the energy. And unconditional openness, really, when you think about it, what is that sort of pointing to? It's just another name for love, isn't it? Unconditional openness. The Christian or Jewish are probably also, or Sufi, probably all the monotheistic religions have said at one time or another, God is love. And I think that's a pointer to the nature of this reality. I hear different people describe their sense of this reality, and sometimes it sounds very sort of detached and almost cold, like it's this detached observer. And I have to say that's not my experience. My experience is that it's this absolute unconditional openness that absolutely unconditionally embraces and loves all that is. And there's a very beautiful passage from the Christian mystic known as Julian of Norwich. I just learned how to pronounce that correctly. Norwich, not Norwich. We have Norwich, Connecticut, so for years I've been saying Julian of Norwich. Now I say it correctly in the true British way. Julian of Norwich. And there's a great passage, it's basically Revelations of Divine Love, is her account of a series of visions she had at the beginning of her hermit life. She lived a hermit, an eremitical life attached to a church in a little anchor hold. And you can go to Norwich and see it if you like. I'd suggest it'd be a nice little trip maybe. And she had all these visions of Jesus, of saints and Mary and so on. And she wrote them down, I think also at the behest of her spiritual director, which many monastics do. And there was one particular vision that's really a lovely sort of account where Jesus in the vision is holding a little round ball, brown object in his hand. And she said it looked like a hazelnut. And she said he was looking at that object very tenderly and lovingly. And she was so puzzled. And she asked Jesus, she said, "What is it you're looking at, Lord? And why do you look at it so lovingly?" And Jesus said, "This little thing is all that is. And I love it because it is." So that's a beautiful pointer to surrender and to this consciousness and the nature of it, that it loves what is simply because it is, and it fully embraces and envelops whatever arises, and it also embraces and envelops the going of something. It absolutely accepts unconditionally and is absolutely open to whatever comes, to whatever goes. So does that get the tone of your kind of question?
I'm just another question. Because I had what you would call an enlightenment experience, whereby it was like a gobsmacking experience of this is it, everything was it. Everything, I described it as everything being painted with the same stuff. And I mean, everything was it, like that would be it. The chair is it. And it was all, but then that sort of went away.
That's normal. I mean, that's a normal...
I've had other glimpses before that. This was like a really thing, but it went away.
Yeah.
In non-duality sort of terms and speak, as you mentioned before, it would be saying, there was also a sense of like, when teachers say that there is nobody here, I really knew what they meant by that. But then, I think my question is, how do you get to stay? How do you get back to it? Because it seems pretty hopeless if there's nobody here to do anything, to go anywhere, to...
Yeah, well, it's true there's nobody here, and it's true there is somebody here. Both are true on different levels. You know, in the Buddhist teaching, they talk about the absolute and relative levels, or absolute and relative teachings. You know, on an absolute level, all that's real is what's eternal. So on an absolute level, all that's real is this pure consciousness that permeates all that is, that's always simply present. That's the essence of who you are. That's who you are in your unchanging essence. But arising and ceasing in that are all the forms that we see all around us, including this form and that form that we call by names and have a sort of body and a mind and a personality. And so those forms arise out of this pure consciousness and they recede back into it. But they are themselves manifestations of the formless reality that this is pointing to. So they have their validity. You know, it's true to say they're not ultimately real, they're not absolutely real, but they're relatively real. They're not absolutely important, but they're relatively important. You know, and I think that's a kind of shift that's happening in the non-dual spiritual movement in the West, is it's beginning to come to a kind of maturity where people are seeing you've got to integrate the formless and the form. You've got to integrate, my new book's called Fully Human, Fully Divine. You know, we have a divine aspect of who we are, and we have a human aspect that's an expression of that divinity in form. Like in the Christian teaching, they talk about the incarnation, tribute to Jesus exclusively. What if that were true of every single person on the face of the planet? What if that were true for me and true for you? You know, that we are an expression in form of the formless consciousness of God, you could say. You know, and everything is, just like you said. This tape is, this shop is, this floor is, you know, all the statues, all the trees, all the plants, all the people, all the dogs, all the cats, all the aardvarks, all the ants that the aardvarks eat. Everything is an expression in form of this formless reality. So what we eventually come to in a clarity of knowing and a clarity of awakening, of awakened living, is that life, reality, God is one. It's a unity. It's one whole. It includes absolutely everything and excludes absolutely nothing. So there's not this problem between the physical phenomenal world and the absolute world of pure consciousness, that they flow in and out of each other in the context we find ourselves in, this human experience. For now. What will happen in the future, I don't know. You know, but right now, that's what we have, isn't it? We have this formless, transcendent example. But there's not a contradiction there. You know, they're different levels. That's why, like in the Buddhist teaching, they talk about the absolute and the relative levels. And both have their place, like opposite sides of a coin. You know, you got heads and tails of a coin. But you can't separate the heads and tails, can you? They both make up the coin.
Can you get back to it?
You know what? It's just the natural trajectory of awakening. You go through a phase of got it, lost it, got it, lost it, got it, lost it. I went through years of it, where I had little glimpses into this reality. Some of them came and went very quickly, like within minutes, the first ones, just for a few minutes. You know, I remember the first one, I was 22 years old. I had just done a Zen retreat. I was walking down a cloister hall, and from one end of the cloister to the next, I was totally present. This presence was the reality that was right in front of me and who I really was. I wasn't separate from God. The presence of God and my own presence here and now were one, and I realized that for about 2 minutes. And then it went. And then it came back again, and then it went, and then it came back again, and then it went, and then it came back again, and then it went, and it began to just dance with me in a certain way. And then eventually I realized it is me, you know? It's who I am. And I got to a point where I realized that to such a depth that it's never, ever left. It's like losing the idea that you have a head at this point, you know? You know you have a head, or you know you're a human being, you know? You don't have to keep reminding yourself, I'm a human being, I'm not a giraffe, I'm not a giraffe, I'm a human being, not an aardvark, not a dog, I'm a human being. No, you just know you're a human being. It's natural for you. You know, it's always there in a certain way, right? But the coming and going of it is just a natural unfolding. It's part of the journey. In some traditions, in the Christian tradition, they talk about the dark night of the soul. That's essentially the going part. When you know, it comes and you're thrilled, you know, you're in bliss, you're in happiness, you're in unconditional peace, and then it goes and you're bereft of your lover. You know, they talk about it in mystical literature, like the Song of Songs. They talk about the beloved and the lover and the beloved, and they're finding each other, they're searching for each other, and then they connect, and then they depart, and then they look again, and then they find each other, and then they depart, and that's just the name of the game. I mean, that's what happens with this journey. So I wouldn't worry about it. You know, just keep doing your practice.
What practice then?
You're not doing a practice?
I'm not really. Well, I do Tai Chi and Qigong.
That's a practice.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And occasionally do a bit of sitting and stuff.
I think it might be good for you to just do that more than occasionally.
Yeah.
Do it as a regular daily discipline.
I was sort of dabbling with century prayer a little bit as well.
Mm-hmm. I would suggest to anyone that taking that up as a daily spiritual discipline is probably the best thing for most people. Some people do awaken with no spiritual practice, but like I said, like winning the lottery, it's not the norm. You know, it could happen to you, but like winning the lottery, you know, if you're planning on winning the lottery as a retirement plan, I would discourage that. I don't think that's a good plan for you, you know. It might work out for you, but chances are good that it won't. So I would say the same thing with this. It might work out with you to just sort of be casual about meditation and not really do a focused practice, but that doesn't work for most people, frankly. It really doesn't. That's both been my own personal experience and the experience of working with other people for some time. So that would be my advice. I'm not one of these nothing to do, no one to do it people. So.
What would you advise for someone like me who simply has the idea in her head she would like to sit quietly, but can't? For some reason, after about 2 minutes, some thought passes and I'm
Yeah, sure. Yeah, normal, totally normal. I mean, it's like somebody has the idea in their head, I'd like to play tennis. You know, so you go to play tennis and what happens? Are you like a Wimbledon champ like the first day? No, probably not. Again, it's possible. You might be one of these kind of gifted people that has that, but probably it's unlikely.
But how would I get
how do you learn to play tennis?
You mean practice?
You play tennis.
Do it, yeah.
Yeah, it's the same thing. Jack Kornfield, who was a kind of teacher of mine in Vipassana, he has this analogy of the puppy, of training the puppy. You know, you put the puppy on the paper and you say, stay. And what's the puppy do? It wanders off, goes, pees in the corner, does whatever puppies do. You pick it back up and you say, stay. And what's the puppy do? It puppies around, you know. Meditation practice. You know, with any practice, with playing the piano, with playing tennis.
There has to be intention, you're saying, really, that one would...
There has to be intention, and I think there has to be, in most cases, some guidance. You know, I think most people need to find out from somebody who's walked that path themselves, who's seasoned person, who's mature in their own spiritual life, who's come to a sense of clarity. And that's what teachers are for, and it's important to find one that's trustworthy and honest and good, but your heart can tell you that. Your heart can help you with that. But I would say most people would find that helpful. So like my advice about these things is not the typical sort of neo-Western Advaita thing that you hear often, is there's nothing to do, there's no one to do it, just sit around and it'll hit you one day. That's not my advice. I think that's possible, but I don't think that's hardly ever the case. It's certainly not the norm. And so I think I have to give advice, especially in a kind of general context like this, I have to give advice that's generally true for most people. And sometimes you work with individuals and it's different for each individual. Where they're at on their path, how their path is unfolding is different. There are different seasons even in the life of one person. At one time, they may be doing a lot of meditation practice. At another, their primary thing may be surrender. At another, their primary thing may be compassionate service in the world. And that will teach them the seamlessness of all that is, that I'm not really separate from all these people or animals of the planet that I'm serving. You know, that's what can come out of that practice. So it's different for everybody, but I would say, get a regular practice that you try every day to be faithful to, and also get some guidance to help you with the ups and downs of that, which you will have. There's no doubt about that, like you're describing. But that's totally normal, absolutely normal. Does that help?
Yeah, just that, sorry to labour it, but I have read many times that some people have been meditating for 40 years and still haven't realised.
Yeah, possible. Some people meditate for 5 minutes and realize. Some people meditate for 40 years and realize. Some people meditate for 5 years and 10 years and 15 years and have self-realization. It's just absolutely different for everyone. I mean, it's like if you started a race and you had somebody starting at the starting line, somebody starting 5 meters beyond that, somebody else starting 20 meters beyond that, somebody else starting 30 meters beyond that, and somebody else starting 2 feet behind the starting line. And the gun goes off, and they all run around, and they all end up at the finish at different times, you know, quicker or slower. It's like that. We're kind of karmically made in such a way that we all start at different places. We don't all start at the same place. And we have to just learn some patience, you know. But there was a little saying by a great Christian mystic known as Catherine of Siena, and it's very nice. She says, all the way to heaven is heaven. So all the way to the finish line, all the way to enlightenment is itself enlightenment. All of it's a blessed moment of now, of here and now. And what's that? That's enlightenment. Like realizing that we're simply here and now, and that we always have been, that this presence that we are in the deepest level has always been present and can't not be present. That's awakening. And even awakening happens on many different levels and depths. You know, there are deeper scenes of that. There are less deep kind of understandings of that. And it's endless. I mean, you see that with some clarity on some level, and it just gets deeper and deeper and deeper. I often say it's like a spiral going deeper into the heart, that just, or into the earth, like mining something. It just goes around and goes in deeper and deeper and deeper, and it's infinite. You know, the reality that we're having clarity about, that we're realizing, is infinite. So the unfolding of our understanding of that has to be infinite. This idea that you wake up and you're completely finished and there's nothing more, it's not my experience anyway. I see the depths of that continue eternally, infinitely. Don't think that there's one answer to that. I mean, I think that can be very significant for some people, and they find it very helpful to to refrain from eating meat or whatever. And if you do, that's great. And if you don't, then you don't see that, and that's fine too. I just think we're all at different points on that journey. So I would never say everybody must be vegan or everybody must eat meat, for that matter.
One more question.
I think all that stuff, I mean, I just saw actually a Superman movie this past year, and I felt like it was really, there was a lot of spiritual sort of metaphor going on there and stuff, and it was pointing, I thought, in a way, to like the Superman within all of us, or the kind of true nature within all of us. Not that it's Superman in the sense of losing our humanity, but that there is a kind of nobility and strength and courage within all of us that we need to discover. And I could see the parallels in the story, but you know, as far as, I mean, I don't know, that could maybe be helpful for some people and not so much for others. And I don't have a strong opinion about that. I wouldn't say they're bastardizing anything that I know of. Oh, no, I mean, in the Christian mystical tradition, there are certainly spiritual fathers and mothers who could be called maybe a guru by some other tradition, but I think there is a reality of transmission that happens with people. I don't know if I'd use the word guru. I certainly don't think of myself as a guru, strictly speaking. But there's definitely, if somebody has come to an abiding sense of self-realization, they radiate that presence in the world. You feel it just when they are in the room with you, if you're sensitive to that, if you're open to that. And there is a transmission that can happen, that's possible. But that's not the only thing. I mean, there's also spiritual practice. There's also consciously working on your own spiritual path, maybe with that person. So I think it's helpful to be in the presence of people who are self-realized, but it's not by itself. I don't think it's the only way, you know. But there's a reality of transmission for certainly.
And does that carry on working even with the service from the person? So say.
Oh, it really does.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
I mean, I've had experiences with students that I've had where I feel like I'm kind of with them at different times, or I feel something's going on with them, or that I'm working with them on some level. And when I do retreats, I feel that. I can just look around the room and feel like something's exchanged between me and another person that's on the retreat. And I think there is definitely a transmission. There's no doubt in my mind. Huh?
On your personal journey, did you have that happen for you?
Oh, sure.
Right.
Yeah. I had, I'd say 3 or 4 really good teachers, and I had some teachers that were just people that I was ministering to, that I thought of as me being a minister to them, And they actually were great teachers for me and opened up different aspects of this for me in various ways. I talk about one woman named Mary in my book, who I was a hospice chaplain for a time, and she was a woman with a terminal illness that really, really taught me a lot about surrender, and I felt that she was really my teacher of surrender and had given me a transmission in the practice of surrender. So, you know, our teachers in life, our gurus, can come in all different forms, you know. Some of them are in human form, some of them are in cat form, some of them are in dog form, some of them are in tree form. You know, they're all different. Ramana had a guru that was a mountain, you know. So they come in all these different forms. We just have to have, as Jesus said, we have to have eyes to see and ears to hear. We have to have an openness and an ability to sort of see what God puts right in front of us for our good. Maybe somebody else. Yeah. Anybody else have a question? Yes.
You have used the word prayer, that you have developed your own prayer. I just look into your book.
My own prayer?
In your book you mentioned that you have developed your own prayer. Yeah,
I call it the prayer of simple being.
Prayer,
It's based, though, I say even in the book, it's based a lot on centering prayer, it's based a lot on meditation.
Because in Advaita, in consciousness awareness, there is no space for the prayer.
In what now?
There is no space for the prayer, because prayer means there's somebody else, the God, imagination, idea. And second thing I want to ask you, compassion.
What was the first, a statement or a question? I didn't hear a question in that first part.
Compassion. Use the word compassion.
Yeah.
When you realize that all beings and consciousness travel all over, then he asks about vegetarian or vegans, you know. When you know that other object is a cow, is a goat, is a chicken or any form, and you know it is the same consciousness as me, then where is the compassion? If you are compassionate, you cannot kill, thou shalt not kill. That is in the Bible. But all the Christian, all the mystics eating the meat.
Okay, well, thank you for your teaching. I didn't hear a question, but...
So where is the compassion then in it?
I think eating something doesn't necessarily mean there's no compassion.
If you're compassionate...
Yeah, but that's a cycle. That's also a cycle of life. I mean, we consume and we're consumed, and that's true for everything. That's true for people even.
Yeah, but there is not a vegetable, it is a being who have fear, who don't want to die.
How do we know vegetables don't have that?
No. That is they don't have organ, they don't see, don't realize, they don't escape. You know, this is very subtle sense. They are also alive, but this is very alive phenomenon. You know, it's not that same fear as you have. Same that you want to protect your life, they want to protect life, they're killing them. So that's what he asked, but we avoid the question. He asked about vegan. Yes. That if you are really
well, you've given him an answer, so it's fine.
No.
I think we're all at different places, you know, on our journey. And I am at a place now where I don't even kill insects. I can't kill an insect. I just...
You eat meat.
Huh?
You eat the meat.
I didn't say I eat meat, and I didn't say I didn't eat meat.
But
do you eat meat?
No.
Oh, of course not. Yeah. Well, what about you? Do you eat meat?
No. It's not my things, but I ask you. That he asked the questions, you avoid the question. That's what I mean. If compassionate person, awakened person who realizes himself.
Okay, well, let me try to answer the question. Yeah. I think we're all at different places with this. And as things unfold, things become more clear to us on different levels. So my not answering the question was just basically saying that I'm not saying that everybody should be a vegan. I'm not saying that everybody should eat meat. I'm saying that we all need to figure that out for ourselves, and we all figure that out for ourselves in different ways at different times. We're all, like I say, at different points of our journey. So I think to just give a blanket answer and say everybody should do this all the time is probably not the best approach. I mean, I've been working with people for some time, and I don't find that that usually works. Even if it's true that everybody would do well to avoid this and do that, you can't just in a blanket way tell everybody to do that. Some will do it, some won't. Some will try it, some will be completely closed to trying it. So I think you have to be open to people's life unfolding as it unfolds. You know, it's different for everyone.
But when it comes to the personal level, example you are.
Okay, this is not going anywhere.
No, I want to ask you.
I had one more question, and I think I've used my time up because we only have an hour.
The personal question to you, in this process of going to monastery.
You know what? You can talk to me afterwards.
Oh no, I'm not interested in that.
Okay, well, it's there.
I'm not in debate.
It's there. It feels like a debate. So what's your one more question, and that's it. Well, the Tibetan Book of the Dead I've read is not such a dark thing. It's about death. It's about dying. It's not death in the sense of some black evil thing, occult magic or anything like that. That's not the nature of that work.
Okay.
But there certainly is, there can be a kind of unwholesome, self-centered sort of quality to even some sorts of spirituality. But I don't know enough about that. Huh?
How do you avoid that? Just don't look at it.
I think your heart will lead you, and your heart will tell you if something's wholesome, if something's if something has a kind of loving nature to it, and you can feel that in the energy of a teacher or somebody who's teaching a spiritual path. You can discern that, I think, with time, gradually. And I think if you have in your heart the intention that you want to grow, in love, that you want to be kind, that you want to find God, that there's a kind of wholesome intention in your heart for your path, that will lead you and guide you. And that will keep you from falling into things that could be maybe harmful to yourself or others.
Other languages, other religions. Why is that happening?
Well, I mean, I think that's a matter of perception. I don't know that everybody looks at it that way. I mean, there certainly are things in Christianity that are less than helpful, but there are things in Hinduism that are less than helpful. There are things in Buddhism that are less than helpful. There's no spiritual system or teacher or person anywhere in the world that doesn't have both good points and bad points. You know, that's the nature of this phenomenal world. There's nothing that's somehow all good or all bad. I think Christianity, on the whole, has done a lot of good in the world. I mean, there's been a lot of charitable organizations and things like that, and people feeding and taking the poor off the streets and all kinds of things. And there have been a lot of the kind of things you described. But I think it's really a matter of how we perceive it. Like, if we're looking for good, are we looking for bad? Are we sort of open to just receiving what we receive in life? I mean, I think there are aspects of the Christian path that can be helpful, and there are some that aren't. But I would never say, like, on the whole, I would never say that about anything, that, oh, it's all bad, it's all sort of...
I mean, every religion has...
Well, you can glean something from everything, but there's an old Indian story about a man who wanted to find water. So he wanted to dig a well. So he went to his backyard and he dug a hole about 10 feet deep, and he didn't find any water. So then he dug another hole about 10 feet deep and didn't find water, and then he dug another hole, and before he knew it, his whole backyard was filled with holes, but he hadn't found any water. So while I think everything has something to offer, it has something that you can grow from, that you can learn from, it's probably best to pick one or maybe two things and dig down and go as deeply as you can into them and see what you can discover. That to me seems like a wiser way to approach it than just doing a lot of different things. We can go too far in that. We can end up being so eclectic that we kind of get nowhere. So it might be worth thinking about, where does my heart call me? What practice or path really calls to me? And then follow that out and see where that takes you ultimately. That would be my advice. Okay?